Today we're going to be taking a look inside a manual transmission to see what's inside and how it works. And we're also going to take a look at what makes these transmissions so strong, so fun to drive, yet so reliable and economical. Now I'm going to be removing the engine and transmission from this 2003 Honda Accord with the manual transmission. Now with the fuse box and everything out of the way, we have clear access to the shift linkage over here. Now on the top of the transmission, the sideways shifter lever is going to control this arm to push it down or pull it back up when you're in neutral. Then moving the shifter into and out of the gears back and forth is going to move this arm, and that's what's going to engage it this side or this side. So any combination of either pushing it down and then moving it in is what's going to lock it into a gear. So here I've got the transmission completely removed from the vehicle. I've also removed the flywheel, which is bolted to the crankshaft. Then I've also got the pressure plate here, and sandwiched between them is the clutch, and this clutch is splined to the input shaft. Now taking a look around this transmission, we've got the input shaft here, then we've got the output, which is where the differential is housed and your accelerator is going to plug into in order to transfer torque to each wheel. Now the purpose of a transmission is to take input torque and transmit it to the wheels according to the gear selection that the driver makes. Now taking a look at the top of this transmission, we have our selector here where our cable is going to attach to, as well as the other one that will move from side to side with a shifter. Over here at the front we have the clutch slave cylinder, which is going to work with hydraulics to actuate that clutch. Now in addition, there's also a speed sensor on the output shaft. Now I'm going to begin this teardown by removing all the 12mm bolts all the way around that hold the bell housing to the transmission. Remove these 10mm bolts that hold the shifter linkage on. Okay, I'm going to loosen this guy off. Just going to remove this little plug here. I wonder if this is a magnet or something. And with that plug gone. So before I split this bell housing, I have to remove the slave cylinder. Now it's hydraulically actuated to actuate this little arm here. And this arm is what's going to pivot back and forth to engage and disengage the pressure plate. Next off, I'm going to slip off this pilot bearing here. You can see this one is pretty much toast. It's making so much noise. And then I can remove this fork here, which just pivots about this ball joint over here. Let's try to pry this case off here. So I was having some difficulty removing the top half of this transmission casing from the bell housing, and I realized you have to remove this 14mm hex. Of course I don't have a hex, so I'm going to use a 14mm bolt and put that in there. I've got a double nut over here with my wrench in there, and I'm going to use that to try and break this bolt free. It's not working. Alright, so I'm having some trouble removing this, so I'm going to have to cut it. And then I can use a hammer and a chisel here. Then I open that plug. Inside of here there's a circlip that I need to disengage. The circlip is stuck, so I'm going to make an incision along here. And I'm just going to extract this circlip here. This is not how you open a transmission. And there we go, I can remove the case from this transmission. So here we've got the manual transmission opened up here, and you can see that there's two main shafts, this one here being the input shaft and this one being the counter shaft, which ultimately drives the final drive at the differential here where the wheels will plug into. Now both of these shafts rotate on these bearings here that are in the casing. We've also got the reverse idler gear here. Now each one of these shafts have a bunch of gears on them. Each of these gears are actually free spinning. They don't turn with the shaft themselves, they just spin along the shaft, and they're intermeshed with a gear on the input side here. Now we understand from gear ratio principles that having a larger driven gear than the driving gear is going to result in an overdrive condition, which means that this gear here is going to spin slower than the output, which is going to spin faster, and you kind of want that on the highway where your engine is spinning nice and slow so you save fuel, but your wheels are spinning at highway speed nice and fast. And on this 5-speed manual transmission, this here is the 5th gear. Now here's a close look at how the gear ratios look. We've got a nice big gear for 5th gear over here that's driving a smaller gear, and then you can see this gets smaller for 4th gear, for 3rd gear, and for 2nd gear buried inside of here. Now if we skip past this counter gear, down inside there you can see a very small gear that drives this large gear, and that's for 1st gear to give you a lot of torque multiplication for takeoffs from a stop. Now because these gears are free to spin on these shafts here, they don't interfere with each other, where you have a high gear ratio up here and a low gear ratio down here, and they can freely spin as they're meshed. And then the question arises, how does the input shaft and output shaft engage itself to these gears to select a particular gear ratio? Now the answer to that is synchronizers. It's basically this ring over here that's going to take the power of the input shaft and transfer it to a particular gear. So for example, we have this shifter fork over here that has this collar on it. Underneath there, we've got this spline over here. Now this spline is actually tied to the input shaft, so they rotate together, but the gear itself is free spinning. So in order to lock them together, you've got to move this shifter fork down like that, and that's going to lock this spline shaft here with this particular gear, which happens to be third gear. So now you've engaged the two together. Now what controls the position of the synchro ring here is this shifter fork, and that's tied to the shift linkage mechanism. So you can see it's got three main positions. It's got its middle position here, and that's where that input shaft is going to spin that spline on the inside, but because it's not transferring any of the power to the fourth gear or the third gear, which are both free spinning, this is kind of like neutral. If you move it a little bit up, it's now going to engage fourth gear, and if you move it all the way down, it's going to engage third gear. Now the same thing can be done at the top here for fifth gear, where we've got this shifter fork here. Now if I move this up over here, we're now in the neutral position, because that spline shaft and that synchro are going to turn together inside of there, whereas this is going to be free spinning because you've got that gap in between there. Now once I push this down, it's going to engage with the teeth on that fifth gear there, and now fifth gear is engaged. Now the shifter arm for the fifth gear here is also shared with this little counter gear here. You can see as I engage it and disengage it, it also moves up and down, and that's going to engage reverse. Now you can tell it's a reverse gear because it has straight cut teeth as opposed to these nice beveled teeth on all the forward gears, and that's what causes that whirring noise when you put it in reverse. Now when fifth gear is engaged, the shift mechanism does not allow this gear here to interfere with any of the gears here. You can see that it's actually slightly offset there, so they're not going to touch each other and engage. Now if I actually push this gear down to engage reverse, you can see that it's going to touch the input shaft gear here, which is the straight cut one dedicated for reverse. That's going to rotate this guy, which is going to change his direction, and that's going to rotate this counter shaft gear over here, which is straight cut. You can see that the gear ratios are actually different than first gear, and that's just to prevent you from doing burnouts in reverse. Now the input shaft carries third, fourth, and fifth gears with their respective synchronizers, but there's not enough room back here to have the first and second gear synchronizer, so instead they've put that on the counter shaft over here. You can see this here is the synchronizer ring here, and it's going to have the same groove here that's going to be tied to this counter shaft, and once you engage it as it is in first gear over here, it's going to lock those two together. You can see I can move it back up to the middle here. That's going to be our neutral point, where the teeth on the inside here are just going to free spin with the synchro and not engage the teeth on the first gear or the second gear. Then once I move it all the way up, we can engage second gear over here, and that's the synchro teeth here that's going to engage with second gear. Now since manual transmissions don't have a fluid pump to recirculate all the oil, it just relies on gravity and the movement of these gears themselves to kind of self-lubricate. It's got this plastic baffle over here, which is going to scoop up some of that oil coming off of the final drive here and kind of redirect it through these little holes over here to lubricate the counter shaft and thus the input shaft when they're engaged. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at is how does the shifter action, which mostly just rotates this way and moves up and down this way, translate into the shifting of these forks to move these synchros to engage and disengage gears. Now taking a look at the shifter, we have two main functions here. We've got one cable that's going to tie up inside of here, and that's primarily responsible for moving this assembly in and out relative to the casing where this thing is mounted to. And then we've got the second arm over here where the other cable mounted to, and that's going to move this piece over here into three different positions. Now that little tongue here is what's going to sit inside of these little C shapes here that are linked to the shifter forks. So you can see that fifth gear and reverse gear is linked to this outside one. We've got this one here, which is your third and second gear directly in the middle, and then the last one at the back here was first and second gear over here. So this guy is going to sit inside of here just like that. Now since we know that this mechanism moves in and out, the little tongue here is also going to move in and out to either select first and second, third and fourth, or fifth and reverse at the edge here. Now moving this arm here is what's going to move the tongue up and down, and that's going to push up and down on these fork linkages up and down here to engage those synchros. I'm going to continue disassembly here by removing these little brackets. And I can remove this bracket. This is the one that's responsible for engaging the reverse idler gear up and down. Turn this over here and remove it from the casing. and remove the differential from the casing as well. So here we've got the gears removed from the transmission, and these have quite a lot of oil on them from lubrication, so I'll just come in with my wife's old dress here and wipe that up. Now with the shafts out side by side here, we've got a close look at each individual gear, with this being first, second, third, fourth, and fifth gear. Now the reverse one here is the one with straight cut teeth. You can see there's a gap in between here, which is going to be filled in by the reverse idler once it engages. Now the gears that can rotate are the ones that have the synchronizer next to them. So for example, this is third gear here. This one can rotate on the shaft freely, whereas over here it's kind of fixed. That's going to allow you to transmit power from this one over to this one. But if this gear is not engaged, it's just going to free spin just like that. So next up, I'm going to remove this ring here. This is the thing that engages with these forks here. You can see they match up and move up and down. Alright, so I've got a puller on there. I'm going to pull this bearing off. So there's the bearing. And here we have the sleeve. Then we have one ring over here, another sleeve. And now if I turn the shaft over, you can see that all of these gears start to come out right here. Gears are getting really oily. I'm going to need to use my wife's old dress again to clean everything up, especially this oily shaft. Now if we take a closer look at how fifth gear works, if you remember, this was a free spinner on the input shaft here. It slides on these needle bearings here that rides up on the sleeve, and that sits in this spot over here. However, you do have this other set of teeth that's machined on the same gear here on the inside, and that locks into this little shifter ring over here, just like that. So when the shifter fork moves this up and down, it's either going to unlock it and keep it in neutral, because it's free spinning, or completely lock it up so that it's in fifth gear. Now also inside this shifter ring, which locks the fifth gear, is this piece over here. Now this one's externally splined over here, and that's going to lock inside of that ring, and this ring is going to move in and out to engage and disengage fifth gear. Now this guy is powered off of the input shaft because it's splined over here and here. So if you do want to engage fifth gear, you got to transfer torque from this input shaft to this spline over here, then to this ring. Then this ring here has the shifter slider, which is going to slide over and engage fifth gear over here, and that's going to allow this gear over here to be fixed to the input and therefore transfer torque over to the countershaft here. Now because this is a manual transmission and you're going to be rowing through different gears, your wheel speed and thus the countershaft speed is going to be different than the input shaft speed, which is coming from the engine. Now when you do try to change into fifth gear, for example, we have the torque from the input shaft over here that's going to come through this guy and therefore power the movement of this collar. Now this collar is going to try to engage with this gear here. Now this gear is meshed to the counter shaft, so it's going to have its own speed. Now if the RPMs don't match with each other and you try to engage them, you're just going to get a lot of grinding and cause a lot of damage to the transmission. So as a result, what you need to do as a driver is to shift into neutral, so this is free spinning, and then tip the gas on your accelerator pedal to increase the speed of the input shaft to match the speed of the wheels through this counter shaft here. Once the RPMs are the same, then these two can engage in harmony without any grinding, and you can have a nice smooth shift. However, that does take some driver skill in order to match those RPMs, and you still run the risk of these teeth wearing off too quickly if the RPMs don't match. And that's where these golden color synchronizer rings come in to help you match the RPMs of your input and your output shaft. So the synchro ring is sandwiched in between here, and it's got its own teeth on it that match the pitch of the teeth on this gear here. Now the key to this synchro ring is this tapered shape here. You have a taper on the gear, and you've got a taper on the inside here that match. So now when you've got your input shaft moving at one speed and the output shaft moving at another speed, as they slowly come together, those tapers are going to start to engage with each other, and friction is going to cause them to match the speed with each other until they're fully pressed together and engaged. And at that point, your ring can slide over and engage them physically with these teeth over here. So you can see by using this taper design to slowly match the RPMs, as you jam it into gear here, you're saving these teeth from getting chipped out and worn out and grinding up your transmission. Now one of the main wear points on manual transmissions are the synchronizer gears. You can see this one here is a little bit dark colored because it's been used a little bit. You can see the gear here doesn't have too much wear on it. Now if you compare that to the synchronizer that's in front here, it's actually brand new because there's actually no 6th gear on this transmission. I'm not really sure why Honda would put a synchro for something that doesn't really exist, but that's what a brand new one looks like for reference. And here's a close look at second to first gear. You can see you can move it out of gear to be considered neutral because first gear and second gear could rotate independently. Once you engage it over here into first gear, it's now going to lock up. The also interesting to note is the shifter collar itself here carries the straight cut tooth for the reverse gear. It's not actually part of the shaft itself. But this transmission did have a magnet to pick up any extra metallic chunks. You can see as I wiped that off with my wife's dress here, there was definitely a few chunks in there, but nothing to be worried about. This transmission was pretty healthy. Next up, we've got the final drive. Things are pretty simple here. This is just an open differential. I've got another video on how differentials work, so make sure you check that out in the description below. And when your transmission's operating, you've got torque applied to this input shaft. However, when you're changing gears, no matter how good your synchronizers are, it's really difficult to shift into a gear if you've got continuous torque applied on the shaft here. That's why you need to put the transmission in neutral in order to shift the gears. Now, in order to disconnect the transmission to change gears from the engine, you have a clutch. Now the clutch is a friction-like material here that just slides onto the input shaft and is responsible for transferring torque from the engine over to the transmission. Now when torque is required to apply to your transmission, this clutch is going to be engaged. Over here we have the engine flywheel that's going to be spinning with the engine's crankshaft, and over here we have this pressure plate. Now when these are sandwiched all together, the friction of this disc plate here is going to press up against the flywheel as well as the pressure plate, and they're going to spin as one unit, transferring all the torque to the input shaft of the transmission. Now when you need to disengage the clutch, like to change gears, this pressure plate has to back away a little bit, and therefore those are going to continue rotating with the engine, but the clutch is just going to be left in a neutral state, just hanging there with the transmission. Now in order to create that gap between the flywheel and the clutch and the pressure plate, we have this pressure plate with these teeth in the back here. Now this is basically teeth that are made of spring steel, and if you press on these teeth, it takes a considerable amount of force. It's actually going to pivot about this point over here, causing this rotor here to push in very slightly, giving you that gap that you need between the clutch and the pressure plate. Now in order to press the teeth on this pressure plate down and up, you have this bearing over here, which is going to allow the pressure plate to rotate with the engine and flywheel. And then we've got this arm over here that's going to press it in and out. Now that arm sits inside of the bell housing over here and pivots about this center point over here. You can see as I engage and disengage it how it moves it in and out. And that is what's going to engage and disengage the clutch to give you that neutral that you need in order to shift gears. Now since it takes a considerable amount of force to push this pressure plate in to disengage that clutch, you have to have some hydraulics to help you out. So similar to your braking system, we have the slave cylinder over here, and that is going to push this piston out this way, which is going to pivot this arm in and out. And just like your braking system that has a master cylinder, we do have another cylinder over here that when you push the clutch, it's going to push hydraulic fluid through that line to the slave cylinder on the transmission. And just like the brakes in your car, any hydraulically actuated system has a certain feel to it and a point where it starts to bite. Now when it starts to grab the clutch, you're going to have a little jerk in the torque that's applied here because it just suddenly turns like that, and that's why you have these springs here to absorb some of that torsional impact. Now just like the brakes in your car, the clutch can definitely wear out. It's just made of a friction-like material, and if you get a driver who's new and doesn't understand how to operate a clutch properly, this can burn out pretty fast. That's probably the biggest downside of manual transmissions, because to do a clutch job on one of these, it basically means you have to remove the engine from the transmission since it's sandwiched between the two. So while a clutch set might only cost you a couple of $100s, the labor in order to get to it is really what's going to kill you when you have to do a clutch job. Now in a manual transmission, you've also got this heavy flywheel, and that's just to give you a little bit of inertia, especially if you're at a complete stop here with your clutch. You need a little bit of rotating inertia to kind of get you going. Now the equivalent to all of this in an automatic transmission is the torque converter. Now I've got a full video on how torque converters work, so make sure you check that out in the description below. And that's where we come to some of the advantages of a manual transmission. You see, in a traditional torque converted automatic transmission, there's a lot of slipping going on inside of here, which leads to a lot of powertrain losses and heat buildup that's basically wasted. With a manual transmission, the clutch is either engaged or disengaged. There's no slipping that's going on, and therefore no power losses. Therefore, you can not only get better fuel economy by negating these losses, but you can also put more power from the engine directly down to the wheels. Now, in my opinion, the biggest advantage and the reason why manuals might be better than automatics is that you can put a lot of power down through a manual transmission. You see, once you've actually changed your gears and hopefully haven't damaged your synchronizers, it actually forms a hard mechanical connection between the input, which is spline through here, and the input shaft, and the output, which goes through this spline over here to this gear over here directly over to the counter shaft. There's no slipping of clutches, there's no belt that you have to drive, it's just a hard mechanical connection. Now if you compare that hard mechanical connection of a manual transmission to say the belt of a continuously variable transmission, this thing's just going to be a weak link. I've got another video on why CVT fails if you want to check that out, linked in the description below. But I definitely can say that the manual is going to last longer and take more torque. And if you compare that with a traditional automatic transmission, which has these wet clutch packs here, these do wear out because they do have to resist the reverse torque of the planetary gear set that they're holding. Now I do have another video on failed automatic transmissions if you want to check that out, linked below. All that being said though, I think the manual transmission definitely has its place. It's for sure one of the stronger designs that's going to last you a very long time, especially if you know how to properly use the transmission, and you get the benefit of rolling your own gears to enjoy your vehicle or riding the clutch in rush hour traffic. Now make sure you follow me on Instagram to see more behind the scenes footage and subscribe for more videos just like this one.